Nihilist for Independence presents the Angry Scotland Podcast.
I think until Benedict Cumberbatch played him, and I didn't watch that on principle.
What, because you hate Benedict Cumberbatch? Or?
No, no. I mean, Benedict Cumberbatch can be very, very good, and I did like what he did with Sherlock Holmes. But it looked to me as if they were somehow cheerleading what he'd done and making him out to be a sort of maverick genius.
Actually, I listened to a podcast with the guy who, I think he was the writer or director or something like that, and he said, yeah, we're conscious there's a danger falling into the trap when you're doing something like this, when you've got these good actors playing these big parts, that you fall into the great man theory type thing where you're making them out to be these great, brilliant geniuses, whereas it's actually been a big progressive thing that's happened over decades and lots of people have been involved, so I think they were conscious of that.
Yeah, if you cast the person that's very, very successfully played Sherlock Holmes, it's very, very difficult to disassociate that from what you're doing with somebody like Dominic Cummings.
Is he a genius?
He is a different flavour of clever psychopath, just like Boris Johnson.
My feeling on it is, having read a lot about him now, that he has convinced a lot of people by being quite commanding and aggressive in his demeanour that he is possibly more intelligent than he actually is. Cambridge Analytica and the data gathering software, which has really been what's allowed him to get his foot firmly in the door of UK politics. As far as I'm aware, he did not invent any of this technology. He merely exploited it. It's kind of like confusing the pilot of the Enola Gay with Oppenheimer, who invented the bomb. The guy that invents the bomb is actually the genius. You're just the guy that's going to exploit the destructive thing in the worst way possible. And I think that is kind of what Dominic Cummings seems like to me. He's not really the clever creator, but he's able to identify cracks and weaknesses in things and exploiting them in a deeply immoral way. I don't think he's a genius, I just think he's operating on possibly a sociopathic level, therefore would do things and pitch things that a sane person would not.
I think he's a vandal. That's my take on it. When you look at the entire thing, you're like wandering into Downing Street with his trousers halfway down his arse and, you know, his boots unzipped and things like this. And he's trying to create this image that he's the John Lydon of politics almost, if you know what I mean. He tries to say, oh, I'm just a scruffy bastard. But it's exactly the same fucking ploy that Johnson does with the tousled hair and turning up looking like an explosion in a mattress factory.
I was going to say Steve Bannon. He wears two shirts. Mm-hmm. He wears a jacket inside all the time and all this kind of mad stuff.
The thing I take away from that, is that
it's on purpose.
Yes, Dominic Cummings is from a well-to-do background. He went to private school, very, very well educated.
His mother was a behavioural scientist, as well as my understanding.
So my take on him is that he is, like Johnson, he is a posh boy. Now, I want to caveat this by saying that there's actually nothing wrong with coming from a well-to-do background. You're not inherently a prick if that's the case. It's perfectly possible to be working class, middle class, upper class, and not be a terrible human being. You can achieve that. I don't think Dominic Cummings has, but I sense that there is a bit of self-loathing at the core of that. Within his brain, he does not want to be perceived as being a posh rich boy who went to Oxford. He wants to be seen as the scruffy, rebellious character.
It's worth having a look at what he was doing before the Leave campaign. He went to Oxford and he studied under this guy called Norman Stone, who I'd never heard of, except that, when I started researching Cummings, you realise, right, there's a Wikipedia page on the guy who was his mentor at university. And when you start reading into him, you realise, oh, right, he sounds like an absolute fucking arsehole. Genocide denying historian who seems to have taken purposefully controversial takes on history. And you just think, tiresome dick that other historians hate. So that's the guy that's mentored him. He's come from a background where presumably if his mother is a behavioural scientist, then there's going to have been a more unusual upbringing perhaps. And if his mum's into that, then you've got somebody that's looking at people almost as objects.
Subjects, perhaps, rather than
subjects.
objects.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's fairer. And then after university, he goes out to Russia.
The reason why he goes to Russia, which I think is an interesting reason for going, is because this is right after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
So what he's wanting to witness by going to Russia is what happens when a massive political entity collapses
Yeah.
and is forced to rebuild.
Yeah.
And this is very much at the core of his own political beliefs.
Yeah,
Dominic's held the opinion that the only way to facilitate real change in anything
is to burn
destroy it,
everything down.
burn everything down and then reconstruct, which is not what I would agree with most times.
What do we want? Gradual change.
Because the key thing with this is it's not what you're burning down, it's what we're going to build up.
Yeah.
And Dominic seems very much like the kind of guy that I have never heard articulate
What he wants instead.
to create instead. So my theory is what he actually wants is fascism, but he can't say that out loud.
I think he enjoys chaos. Some people are just social arsonists. You know, they just enjoy...
That's why I come back to that theory of the self-loathing thing, because I think that, as I say, if you're from a very privileged background where you've kind of had everything handed to you on a plate, if you're angry about the world, then the only way I could think that you would have that instinctive feeling would be if you didn't like yourself. Fuck, I'm angry and I'm pissed off about something, and then you have to just pick a target. So somebody that would be further down the chain would be witnessing visceral social injustice happening all around them. So they would go, and I'm going to campaign for women's rights, or I'm going to stop poverty. You know, whereas these guys that have all the privilege pick things like the European Union, which, let's be honest, if you had to write a list of the 10 worst things on the planet, the EU probably isn't in them if you had to go even by the governments of the world. So to pick that target, I think it's just, as you say, I want to be a disruptive force to vent out this bitterness about who I am.
So my
And then
understanding
from
of his
him.
politics is that he's like a pure sort of neoliberal kind of Milton Friedman, absolute, just let the markets go, do what they will.
I'm not sure if that is correct, though, from like reading some of the stuff that he's been saying. I think it's more a kind of technocracy that he's willing to, let any of that go if it allows him to win.
It's real fucking terrifying. It's proper nihilism, isn't it? If you know what I mean. It's just like a fucking set fire to everything. Let the
I'm not sure
barbarians.
there's like a deep ideology beneath
Yes,
it
I
that
agree.
like you might get from some of the other like ERG type guys who are like actual paid up members of Thatcherism or whatever. I think he's interested in the game and winning the game, and he's written quite a lot about game theory, and he seems to be very interested in that.
Yeah.
And it seems to be that his thing is like, if you're playing a game of chicken, your thing is to show that you're willing to do anything at all to win.
It's about victory. It's about self-worth. It's about winning. It's not about constructing or making anything better. So ultimately it's tying back to him. You know what I mean? This is not a good man trying to improve society. This is about him trying to prove himself in some way.
I get the feeling that if circumstances had been different, he would have been quite happy to put his ideas behind completely different system or ideology, or
he's
even
not
a different
he's not a
political
member
party.
of the Conservative Party and never has been.
The only
Yeah, that's
consistent
surprising.
thing with his politics seems to be a real hatred of what he sees as being bureaucracy.
Yes.
Because Tony Blair, and I don't want to sound like I'm giving Tony Blair credit in any way, shape or form on this
I know you
podcast,
hate him. It's okay.
But he did have plans when he was in government to try and set up a North of England assembly. So
Yeah, Cummings ran the campaign to stop that.
correct. So when Labour came into power, this is what led to the Scottish Parliament being
Yep.
reopened and so forth. This was something the New Labour were pushing for, was to have more democracy happening at a local level.
That was only because the EU made them, to be fair.
Okay, well that means I don't have to credit Tony Blair, I can credit the EU. Fantastic. But Dominic Cummings, though, as you just said, passionately campaigned against this.
Yeah.
That was, I think, one of his early, I don't want to say success stories, but early political victories was campaigning on the idea that this was a complete waste of money, a complete waste of time, fuck all this shit.
Politicians talk, you pay, was the slogan. I mean, that's really good.
Yeah. So you're looking at an institution that could potentially have been of incredible benefit to the north of England. I mean, certainly if you look at what the Scottish Parliament has managed to achieve for Scotland since it's reopened, that could happen for the north of England. And this arsehole has deprived those people of that chance.
The interesting thing is that it was going to be the beginning of a federalisation of Britain, because the plan was for there to be 3 or 4 regional assemblies in England, which would have removed a whole load of powers from the Westminster Parliament and left the Westminster Parliament dealing with only the reserved issues, which would have meant that there would have been this kind of equilibrium across the UK in terms of what Westminster MPs did. There'd be no English votes for English laws bullshit, because, you know, you would have had these 4 devolved English parliaments, the Welsh Assembly, the Scottish Assembly, the Irish Assembly, and so you start to be kind of more like Switzerland with its cantons and you know, this kind of federal unit. It would be very much more difficult for Westminster to prevent Scotland wanting independence. So it would have been good. I think
it's worth pointing out just everything you just said there. I mean, when you really take that into consideration, a lot of people listening to this podcast might think, who the fuck is Dominic Cummings and why should I care? I mean, that's quite a big change in timeline, if you like. If that had happened, if the North of England Parliament had occurred, we would be in a very, very different country and world to where we are now. And that change largely happened because Dominic Cummings prevented that from happening. This is quite far back in the timeline that we're currently on.
2004.
And he's already having massive influence on UK politics, and yet no one had even fucking heard of this dude. And I only found out this story reading Wikipedia this week.
I didn't realise that he had been doing that, that he had been the person that had done that. Interestingly, that 2004 campaign, I ended up in conversation with somebody on Twitter. I retweeted something about wanting a second independence referendum, and somebody come into the thread and said, "You've only just had one. When's England going to get a parliament?" And I said, "Well, you had a vote and you voted against it. When did this happen?" So I give him the Wikipedia link to the 2004 sort of Northern Assembly referendum. "Oh, I didn't know about that. You probably fucking voted in it. And you probably voted no. England didn't feel like it needed it at the time because England's never felt like Westminster didn't represent it. But you might get a different result now. Maybe you should have another vote." And, you know, you can see the other person,
it's funny how circumstances changing, suggest democratic votes would have to be part of that.
But, you know,
this is part of Dominic Cummings' strategy, because one thing that he is very, very good at doing is getting people to be incredibly passionate about issues
that they never even knew they cared about.
He also wants you to know nothing about. So he wants you to really, really hate the European Union whilst knowing as little about it as possible. This is his skill set.
Yeah.
That's marketing, isn't it? You don't want to know what's inside your Big Mac, but you know you want it.
Perfect fucking
Do you not
analogy.
ask me what is in the vegan steak bake?
He is the kind of guy that, like, you know, if he'd grown up in a different time, he would have been hiring athletes to sell cigarettes back in the 1950s. Like, he is absolutely
He's that guy. Yeah. I mean, the whole point of what the Cambridge Analytica tribe of cunts was doing. I was trying to think of something witty to say there, but I can't be bothered. They're just cunts. I'm listening to Christopher Wiley's book at the moment. That is absolutely fucking brilliant, by the way. That's really, really, really interesting.
The documentary, just talking about how they're all cunts, the documentary called Hacked.
Oh, it's fantastic. Watched it twice.
Watching Brittany Kaiser in that documentary, slowly realised that
the great hack.
She's a bit of a cunt. But she's learned her lesson, and now she's doing everything she can to highlight the fact that don't get suckered into being a cunt and working for an idiot like Nix.
Alexander Nix didn't really understand what was going on there. But he's another kind of Cummings like arsehole, just nihilist twat.
Yeah, again, to come back to that, who's the real genius here? It's Wiley and co that are actually doing all the hard work making this dodgy system. But I mean, the thing is, I say dodgy, but it was also very, very fucking clever. So
Well,
the thing that annoys me about Alexander Nix is the fact that you've actually got this quite good criminal conspiracy going on here. You know, so if I was an evil crime genius, I'd be sat there going like, yeah, fucking doing well here, this is brilliant. And then you've got the Muppet at the head of it that is openly in the middle of a bar, surrounded by lots of people within earshot.
showing off.
Showing off. It must have been kind of frustrating for some of the people that maybe were into the criminal conspiracy, going, this fucking balloon has just nuked this otherwise perfect crime. It's like the fucking Riddler in Batman. I can't resist leaving the clues.
The thing to say about Brittany Kaiser and Christopher Wiley is that they both came from left-leaning political background and were really, really good at what they did and got hired and got kind of suckered in gradually, whereby their reality got shifted over time until all of a sudden they find themselves working for the exact opposite. I mean, my understanding is that Cambridge Analytica bid to work for the Remain campaign first, and the Remain campaign told them they didn't need to spend the money. So then they went and pitched to the Leave campaign, who said, yeah, we'll have a bit of that.
Wiley and Brittany, they're very young. I think they were naive to maybe who they were getting involved with.
Absolutely.
And I think that when you're young, I look back in some of the dumb shit that I've done over the years and think, like, when I was young, I didn't know enough, and therefore I would go along with stuff. You know,
Yeah.
and you can change your mind and your whole world can shift.
And
So I think it'd be wrong to give them a lot of shit and say, oh, why the fuck didn't you guys do this,
the thing is, they both did come out and whistleblow.
Yeah.
Anybody can get caught up in something and take a little while for their own realization of reality to come into focus. And that's what happened with both of them. And then they both did walk away and blow the whistle.
I think to say that, you know, you have to get everything right first time when you're young is asking a bit much of humanity.
The other thing to bear in mind is that neither of them was from a really wealthy background, and both of them were earning a bit of proper money for the first time in their lives. And it's all very well us all thinking what we'd do and how high and mighty we'd be. But I've been in a position where I worked for somebody who sacked a pregnant woman because she was pregnant and made an excuse for it. And I knew that had happened. And I was in no position whatsoever to hand my notice in because I was supporting a family.
Cummings is not the hard-working genius guy. It's these young people that actually did the work. What Cummings and co do, because they're sociopaths, is exploit those people for their own benefits. So that's why you take two young, probably at their core decent people, as you say, coming from more of a left-leaning background, and by the time these sociopaths are done with them, they're being manipulated and pushed in a very, very criminal direction. And thankfully, those two kids almost said, "No, fuck this. We're not going to do this anymore," and pulled it back. But I think that sort of zones in on the question of, is this man a genius? And I don't believe that he is. I think he strikes me as being very much of a bully. I think he seems like one of those guys, based on some of the stories you read about his speech making, for example, and some of these campaigns.
Apparently he can be really, really good at actually rallying the troops. But
we've talked a lot in the past about the three of us being the weirdos in the room, that no matter how charismatic somebody is, if we hear something that sounds kind of bullshitty, we go, wait a minute. But, you know, Dominic Cummings picks up a microphone and just rants for 90 minutes. I think most Scottish people would be like, what did you fucking say? Like, you just stood up for 90 minutes. Like, if you actually had talent, you'd be able to say what you wanted to say in 10. But because you're just a rambling idiot, you're up there for 90 minutes.
Gettysburg Address is like 2 minutes.
But when you read about Dominic's speeches, these people say things like, it was captivating, 90 minutes. And like, they're just so lost in it. They're not actually stopping to think, yeah, what's he fucking saying? What's actually happening
that's
here?
a Trump rally, isn't it? Just
Right,
in a small room with a whiteboard.
Yeah, but that's the thing. The people around him don't seem to have the capacity to recognise this guy's a bullshit artist. That's what that highlights to me. Because no speech should take 90 fucking minutes.
It's objectionable, but we do need to give him credit for what he is good at, which is producing these very, very brief messages that work. So in the 2004 sort of Northern Assembly referendum, it was politicians talk, you pay. That's really good. And then get Brexit done. Get Brexit done. That's Cummings. That fucking worked. That worked because there are a lot of people, whether they voted for it or against it, who are so fucking sick of hearing about it that they just want it done. So that was absolute fucking genius. You know,
I think it was responsible for the 350 million thing as well on the side of the bus, and the, you know, hammering on Turkey thing.
Yeah.
Both of which are bullshit.
Yeah. But
those key messages were very brief and very, might not necessarily be completely honest, but those were very successful. It is just very good marketing.
Yeah.
To just have this catchphrase that just sinks into stupid people's heads.
But again, it plays off the ignorance, because I said previously that, you know, what he wants you to do is get very passionate whilst knowing nothing. So, like, get Brexit done. Like, the questions that would jump out at me would be, what kind of Brexit? What does that
mean? What will Brexit be?
When you say done, when, you know, what does it mean, get it done? You just said there, they just wanted to get rid of it. They just wanted it to be over.
I mean, I just want it to be over.
We're not understanding the... Yeah, it's like we're not understanding the issue.
Yeah.
We just want it to go away. And that, again, completely plays into the, I'm passionate, whilst knowing fuck all about what's actually happening.
It's the thing that presumably keeps causing people to phone into the James O'Brien show and still not have researched a law that they want rid of. When I saw the article in the Times about Dominic Cummings having spent time in Russia, apparently trying to run this airline company.
It didn't take off.
Apparently, I think they only did one flight took off with none of the passengers on board.
One flight took off without the only passenger that was due to fly on it. Right? Now, this guy is a free marketeer. The one time that he has actually tried to run a business, it was a complete catastrophe.
It was probably a tax dodge, though, or some insurance scam.
Well, it's
probably intentionally not worked.
No, I don't believe that at all. I actually genuinely think he's another fucking psychopath. Different flavour to Johnson. Doesn't really want to be loved. He's the sort of person that wants to be feared.
That's something we should zone in on. That's a really good point, because I think you see some people that are psychopaths in politics, and I think it's almost like the film star, film director dynamic going on here. So Johnson wants to be the Hollywood star, whereas Dominic Cummings, I think, actually knows that because he's very socially awkward, he can't be that. So he's going to be a star in the way that James Cameron or Quentin Tarantino are stars.
By being the enfant terrible, yeah.
Exactly.
The thing is, he's hopped from all these different things. So he's working on sort of political campaigns, and he's working for think tanks and things like that, and setting things up. But he's never at any one thing for very long. And that's a real hallmark of somebody that's psychologically not right, because they can't fucking stick at anything. I mean, he said of Downing Street, well, if he thinks he's going to get fired, he'll just walk out, and he doesn't care. That's kind of not normal in and of itself. It's normal to want stability and a career progress, you know, to want a safety net. Only lunatics. Here's the other thing. He's not even 50 yet. I mean, you know, doesn't hate corrode the container that it's fucking kept in. Do you know what I mean?
I hadn't really thought about it like that before, but, you know, most people, especially of that age range, they would be looking back on a life where there's a sense of progression. You're going up. You know, so even Boris Johnson, I don't want to give him credit here, but there's a sense of him going from schoolboy to prime minister. It's like escalation.
He's wanted to be prime minister forever.
Like, kind of rise upwards, whereas Dominic Cummings seems to be plateauing and moving sideways.
Yeah.
His whole life. He's not really moving forward, as it were. He's just bouncing between projects, causing chaos and moving on. Which is, again, for a guy in your 30s, you're thinking, well, at that point, maybe you just haven't found it yet. But by the time you're you know, in your 50s, or what he says, 49?
49, born in 1971, so 48, 49.
So, yeah, I mean, which is very unusual, because you would think by that point somebody would have leveled off to at least going, I am a this, and I'm going to be the best at it. They would have found themselves, which kind of comes back to my I think this guy's got real self-loathing issues going on here.
And he seems to just smash things up.
Yes,
it is the thing, So, working for a political campaign of any sort is always going to be a transitory thing. But then, he starts the think tank, which folded after, I think, only a couple of years, if I remember right. It didn't run for very long. And you just find yourself, what is going on here with these things, that he can't stick at anything? That, to me, is emblematic of somebody that's got psychological problems.
And also not a lot of talent. Because what would seem to strike me is that if you were really, really good, or as good at genius level as he's supposed to be, you probably would be seeing something more akin to that gradual progression and rise. Whereas it seems more like he's having to move around so much to cover for the fact that actually beneath the talk, there might not be actually that much substance.
I think that's it, exactly. And that's exactly what was the case with Johnson, was that, he kept getting caught making up quotes and making up stories and things like that and getting sacked from a paper. But, the posh boy's always got another job to go to. But there's not a lot. He's a hollow vessel. And I think Cummings is another hollow vessel. He's just a different flavour. He's one that wants to be feared and hated, and he thrives on that rather than wanting to be sort of loved and liked. He's also very, very interested in Putin's propagandist Sukov. Sukov is this guy who creates chaos. So, I don't know if you've noticed, but RT runs very left-wing, even though it never says anything against Putin. Right? Whereas Putin's quite right-wing. Sukov actually funds and organises opposition parties in Russia. So even the opposition parties are essentially being organised by Putin. And so you're in that...
wrestling, baby.
This is...
It's all a work. We have to have baby faces and heels.
It's all the work. It's all the work. And that is who Cummings is looking to. That's what he's after. That sort of chaos where you just can't trust anything.
Why I think Cummings is regarded as being a genius. Because I think what people credit him with is actual behavioural change. And this is something the Russians have mastered, is to actually not just win elections, but to actually change the public's perception of reality. And that's, I think, what Cummings is at his core interested in. Not deception as such, but it's to literally take somebody that had no interest in politics and make them aggressively, almost violently passionate about how much they hate the EU whilst knowing nothing about it.
Yeah.
I mean, you're taking human behaviour and you're altering it at a fundamental level, and I think that's ultimately what he is interested in, and perhaps has a kind of perverse enjoyment from doing.
I don't think there's any perhaps about it. I think that's absolutely what he enjoys.
What I'm kind of registering is that there's definitely, you were saying his mother was a behavioural psychologist. I think his core is a very angry human being. He's upset about something, and I suspect it's himself.
He's probably like Leonard in The Big Bang Theory. Do you know what I mean? He's probably the victim of childhood experiments.
Yeah. I can kind of see that a little bit. Yeah. And I think there's probably
putting the baby food at the end of the maze.
But I think it seems to be burn everything down, but actually convincing people that they want everything to be burnt. It's like double destruction almost. It's like, not only do you want the EU to explode and burn everything down about, anything that's a little bit democracy, just torch it, but you actually want to brainwash people. So not convince them with rational arguments or logic or facts.
You just want people to not trust any fact.
You actually want to use technology to adjust human behaviour to fit with your nihilistic views of the world, which is quite heavy shit when you actually say it like that. But that seems to be pretty much it. And the only thing I could diagnose is this guy fucking hates himself. That's the only thing I keep coming back to. Is like, this guy is so fucked up on the inside that's what his agenda is.
But you know what? And I think that's maybe, you're asking, why did we not feel it here in Scotland? I mean, first, the first thing to say is that Facebook advert advertising is really, really targeted. So they wouldn't have been bothering directing any of it at the Nats, for instance, and stuff like that. They would have been targeting it on the exact type of person that was going to respond.
The people they were actually targeting were, if I get this right and correct me if I'm wrong, they were people that were in the I might not actually vote. The people that do not typically vote is actually who they targeted. So the problem with Scotland in terms of targeting was Scotland's very politically active because, if you look at particularly the 2014 referendum, huge turnout, and in most of our elections there is a big turnout because unlike England, we tend to pay attention to what's happening in Europe, what's going on in the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah.
Not all of us, but a lot more of us.
Yeah.
So unlike, say, the north of England, who probably aren't paying a blind bit of attention, we've literally just talked about you guys had a referendum to have your own parliament and
you haven't even remembered.
So that's who he's going to target. So we maybe just weren't as heavily targeted, and maybe that's why we weren't affected by it. But the counter to that, of course, is but we already had our shields up. Because we were paying attention, because we weren't just fucking switching our brains off to this, because we did take part in local Scottish elections, in the European elections. Therefore, our shields are up to Dominic Cummings type characters. So, what is the relationship between Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson? How does that begin, and what is it now?
So, my understanding is that he first came into Parliament as an assistant to Michael Gove once Andy Coulson had been sacked. And Gove and him worked very, very well together, apparently, because Gove is very, very polite and he used to feign ignorance of Dominic Cummings being an absolute vile, sweary, drunken bully.
Drunken?
Oh, yeah. There's lots of tales of him being really, really drunk and abusive to people and things like that. So he's a bully. I mean, he sacked one of Sajid Javid's assistants not long ago, if you remember, and just marched her out, and it was really nasty.
It's like the police to come and
she was escorted off the building
because apparently there's some sort of thing had been leaked.
Yeah,
and he said, give me your work and personal phones and all that," and he looked through them and found one phone number to advisor to the previous Chancellor, Philip Hammond.
Yep.
He's like, that you must be guilty. So I'm sacking
that was it. Summarily sacked. But yeah, so he worked with Gove, and subsequent to working with Gove, then obviously went to work for Leave EU, and obviously Johnson and Gove were then. So that's where those two sort of come in. So Johnson's about 10 years older. They talk to each other as equals. There's absolutely no deference from Cummings to Johnson.
So Johnson is not the superior in the relationship, so to speak. He is not the boss of Dominic Cummings. They view each other as level in
Seems
the relationship. To be. Even though he is Prime Minister, he sees himself as being on the same level as Dominic Cummings.
Well, I don't know.
Or maybe more accurately, does Dominic Cummings see himself on the same level as Prime Minister?
And it's interesting to note that his scruffiness has gone up since he's been working in Number 10. And I by no means think that is an accident.
The email that went out asking for weirdos and freaks, I think, whatever it was, to join him working at Number 10. And that's a deliberate PR effort to make Dominic Cummings the story. I mean, I can come back to my point of wanting to completely cover up the fact that actually you are a top grade Oxford posh boy. You want to be perceived as the little rebellious kid that's looking for the freaks and weirdos of society, the outcasts, which he very much is not. But he's wanting to believe that he is one of these outcasts of society. And I think it's one of those things where if you bullshit long enough, you start to buy into your own bullshit. And maybe enough time has passed now, given his age, that he's able to sort of differentiate where he's come from to the persona that he's now crafted for himself within Number 10.
I genuinely think he's just a vandal. He's somebody that just likes breaking things. And despite the fact that rather than wanting to be loved and liked, as Johnson clearly does, Cummings enjoys being loathed and feared. That's what he's aiming for. But he clearly still wants to be talked about. He clearly still wants to be a story. So here's my little prediction. You can't have two egos like that running together for very long before one of them will get fed up of the other. And one of them's Prime Minister and one of them isn't. So in very much the same way that Donald Trump doesn't like anybody to be too big a story around him and starts firing people, I imagine that Boris Johnson's taste for Dominic Cummings will lessen when Cummings starts to get too much attention, and I think Cummings will seek attention. I also think that Cummings will bring Johnson bad press, a lack of love that will eat at Johnson's need for love, and I don't see it lasting all that long. And I think what will happen is Cummings will set fire to something, not physically, but literally will set fire to some policy area or something like that and walk out in a huff, because that's what psychos do, leaving Johnson with a fucking bin fire in the office.
I'd agree with that. I'd also suggest as an alternative scenario that Cummings seems to be very expendable, which is probably why he's such an asset to the kind of alt-right side of things. We talked about on the previous podcast with Nigel Farage about this almost mafia-like structure to what's going on internationally right now, where you have the big players like Putin, who has legitimate power, but also has an agenda. Whereas you have the guys further down, like your Farages and your Dominic Cummings, who are a bit flexible on the agenda side of things and don't really have power. So they're just the expendable middle-level guys that I think Cummings could quite comfortably, as you say, just either walk out himself or get shown the door, and he'll just fucking evaporate into history, and that'll be the end of Dominic Cummings.
It's possible he knows where the bodies are buried. You know, he's got some dirt in some of these guys that will keep him in the background for a lot longer. True.
Absolutely. What I envisage is that he'll go off to do some other horrible thing somewhere else.
Start a clothing line.
Wellies are us. I cannot see Johnson coping long term with a competing ego of that size. Can you?
Well, I think maybe he is a bit self-conscious about his own abilities, though. And he is relying on this guy, because...
But I think it's a case of those two things happening at the same time. I think what's going to happen is that the longer this goes, the more it's going to become clear that Dominic Cummings doesn't really know what he's doing. I think that eventually, particularly with how the age brackets and the demographics are working with the votes right now, I think that Cummings has an age bracket that he can target. We have an overpopulation of old people right now. So we've got the kind of inverted triangle problem where there's this high-level boomer generation that are outnumbering everybody else, and Cummings can work that market. But he can't work anything beneath that. He's proven that. Now, I think he's trying to. I think a lot of that scruffy dress, that I'm looking for the freaks and weirdos, is a deliberate attempt to tap into that market. But so far, he's shown that he can't do it. So there immediately, you've got your ticking fucking time bomb waiting to go off there alone. But I think even just in terms of the day-to-day running of being in government, being in power, particularly post-end of January when Brexit really starts to kick in, I think people are going to very quickly work out that neither of them, Boris or Cummings, actually have any substance to it. And I think that what his art that he's very good at doing is convincing people in the short term that he has all that ability when he really doesn't. And I think it is just a case of time. I've that opinion about the Trump thing. I've had the opinion in the Brexit thing that for a long time now that this is a temporary state, that this alt-right boomer voting thing is obviously not going to be forever. Eventually, Father Time is going to arrive on the scene and go, right, you guys are done now, away you go, here's the millennials coming up to take that spot, and there are the Gen Zs and everything else, and every indicator is saying that this is a temporary spot until we eventually move into your kind of Greta Thunberg generation, which is not Cummings' market. And actually, if you had talent and ability, someone in his position would be recognizing that and going, if we want this to last for the next 10, 20, 30 years, we have to start making some fucking headway on the millennials. So if you were really clever, that's what you'd be doing your business for, right?
Yeah.
He's not doing that. And he's shown that he can't do that. So again, I think that the clock is fucking ticking on these guys where they will be exposed as the joke that they are. It's already happening with Trump. I mean, I think even there are probably people that voted for Trump back in 2016 that probably did it because they wanted change and all that jazz. And I think a lot of them now must be looking at the shit show as it's played out and recognise the guy's a fucking moron. And I think that is eventually going to happen with England. I think just maybe unlike Scotland, America and England are two countries that they have to take the hit. They have to actually be smacked in the face before they're going to realise, fuck, we've totally arsed this up. But I don't believe, based on what I've seen so far, that Cummings has a future. I mean, is there any indications that you guys have seen that would suggest this guy's going to be a factor moving forward?
Well, I think he's just a sort of mercenary kind of guy who will just change with the flow. I think he has been successful so far, and I don't see any reason why he won't just adapt himself into that, you know, into whatever comes next.
Do you think he can? I mean, how far could you go now that he's on? Now people are aware of him, so people know who he is. They know his history. I mean, could he adjust now based on his recorded history? So back when he's a nobody, it's very easy to move and go, I'm left wing, I'm right, I'm moving between this thing.
He's never been left wing, to be fair.
Well, if you look at the policies like Boris Johnson's talking about, it's like £10 minimum wage, you know, huge infrastructure spending, you know, across the north, stuff like that. That
it's worth remembering. Cummings is from Durham. He is from the far north of England, and it's been a thing of his for some time. It's the Steve Bannon thing, the disenfranchised working class white vote. That is the thing that he's after. It's just that, like Steve Bannon, his view of how you capture that is not through a kind of old socialist ideal, but rather through a blame the other and type deal. But that's why Boris Johnson is promising infrastructure for the north, because Cummings has told him to. It will be interesting to see if anything comes of it, whether or not they actually get anything
Trump
done.
would indicate that it won't.
He hasn't fucking built anything.
Exactly, and this is to come back to that ticking time bomb theory.
Miles
and all
of
this.
wall built? Zero.
Yes. You can say all this stuff and promise it, but the real thing is, can you
that
deliver
might not
it?
actually matter, though, if people just get that sense that you're for that stuff. The actual doing of it, if they don't really notice it not happening,
Right,
doesn't
but
It
actually
depends.
matter.
People do eventually notice if they haven't got a job and can't get one.
The kind of plan they have for what they're doing with Brexit. So again, we're recording this in January 2020, and there are plans for a Brexit Day celebration at the tail end of this month. If I was a prick and I was on that Leave side and I was managing it, I think this is a huge tactical blunder on their part, because I think once the Brexiteers get that day, when they get the fucking blow their load all over the fucking ceiling, yeah, Union Jacks, way! Once you've given them that payoff, so this is like you've planted the seed of Brexit in 2016 and we're building to this moment, but once they have the then what?
Then all there is to do is get some wet wipes and clean up the jizz. And then you feel slightly disgusted with yourself and there's nobody to cuddle you.
This is the psychology with
I've got no idea what you're talking about.
Brexiteers, listen to my wise words, because you're going to know what I'm talking about in a few fucking months. Because once you give them that big payoff, that's it. They're going to be left with, now what? Now what?
Uh-huh.
And that's when the fucking reality will hit in, where all you guys were doing was having a wank. And there's nothing really more to it than that. And that's why I'd be like, keep delaying Brexit Day as far as you can fucking shove it down the timeline. Because I say, once they get that why moment, then they're going to start questioning things. Then it's going to become, well, we've got it. We've got Brexit. So now where's my infrastructure? Why are all these brown people still here?
They'll find another scapegoat, though. There'll be another reason why things are crap.
It's going to get harder and harder to sell it, though. And this is why I think Cummings is probably the kind of guy that will be out of the fucking scene by the time that becomes an issue. Because I think now that it's like, where do you go from there? Like, what's the next lie? Because we've already pushed the fucking lie boat out so far. What do you do next? So once you give them that big payoff moment, then what happens? I think once the reality of Brexit starts to hit in, you don't have that option anymore to have that dangling carrot of the big fuck you moment, because that's all these people are wired for. They're like Cummings. He's used a bunch of fucking Facebook algorithms to alter people's behaviour to just be angry. And they want their big middle finger moment, which in terms of audience psychology is pretty easy to achieve. But once they have that moment, like, then what? You know, it's like when you watch Hans Gruber fall out the window in Die Hard, it's like, okay, right, but then do we really want a movie that's just about what happened with John McClane the next day? Probably not. And that's the kind of audience psychology level you're now dealing with, where you're giving them the big payoff, but with nothing to back up the long term.
Well, your question is how much people will realise that they've been had. I mean, you know, I said some time ago that I'd reluctantly come to the conclusion that there was going to have to be some sort of a Brexit, because otherwise we would just never fucking hear the end of it, and this would drag on like trench warfare for another 2 decades. But I'm equally fearful of the fact that it will happen, and then the problems will then just be, as has happened so far, they'll just be blaming Europe for intransigence and saying, well, you know, they're not doing this and they're not doing that, they're not doing that. You'll have Nadine Dorries wondering why we haven't still got MEPs. You know, they'll
hold on that thought though, because you just said earlier on, like, the Get Brexit Done slogan really worked because folk just wanted this to be over. So the obvious consequence for your audience you're trying to appeal to is they're going to find out that it's not over. Because you can't say, get it done, and then it's prolonged for years afterwards.
They won't necessarily. You know, there's actually a relatively small percentage of the population that really properly pays attention to politics and policy and cause and effect.
I think Dominic Cummings actually said something about this. Someone asked him, like, why do you put all your ideas out in this very comprehensive blog? And he said, folk don't read beyond the first line of anything, especially politicians. Yeah. No one's interested.
This is the amazing thing. He fucking hates politicians. He hates them all and has said so. He thinks they're idiots. He said so in his blog, and yet they hire him because they don't read his blog. You know? I mean, he really has. He's put it all out there. He's told everybody exactly who he is and what he is, and nobody's bothered to read it.
Like, I don't think he's a genius, but I think criminal mastermind might be something you could possibly credit him with, in the sense that there is that I can't resist leaving the clues.
Yeah, I've got James Bond tied up, so now I'm going to extrapolate for 10 minutes on the exact manner in which I'm going to kill him and blow up the world.
You can definitely imagine him in a hollowed out volcano. And actually,
he's Dr. Evil, isn't he?
The thing is, it wouldn't be 10 minutes, it would be 90 minutes based on what I've heard about the speeches length. Yeah.
Well, you said he's like a vandal. I think the way he would present it is he's a disruptor. And that's apparently he's kind of influenced by Silicon Valley, guys like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk.
Yeah, but they're all cunts as well.
Well, the irony is, like, he's got this very kind of rational, sort of technocratic view of politics where you just do things according to a formula. You work out some sort of algorithm and it will create the right kind of a thing to happen. Which is ironic because, like, obviously the big thing about the EU was everyone, like, talking about technocrats and folk who weren't connected to actual people. But that's his actual thing. He's like, the politicians are just idiots that we have, that we can't get rid of, unfortunately, but we'll use them in a way using these techniques. And
I'm not sure he's wrong, by the way.
There is
just
something
think
in
he's
it.
evil.
But I think the thing when he's talking about, like, Peter Thiel and that, these guys are working in private industry, and when you change things very fast, you make great adaptations and bring new things forward very quickly. That can really work brilliantly in private industry. When you try and apply that to the large government system, public servants, it doesn't really fit quite as well.
One thing that I read recently was that Warner Brothers, the film studio, are looking into, I think they're now adopting it, an AI system. You'll effectively put a movie pitch into the computer, and you'll give it the cast, and you'll give it the release date, and it will now determine if this movie will succeed or not. And I think that is the most...
that's going to be terrible. It's just going to be nothing but Transformers films.
But I was going to say that the thing is that the stuff that's worked in cinema is everything that should not have worked. So even things like the original Star Wars film, that came out when sci-fi was on its arse in terms of box office draw. No one thought the first Star Wars movie was going to work, and yet it did. You know, even like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and again, this is not me defending these franchises, I'm just saying it's how the business of the business works. Let's take Robert Downey Jr., who was by his own admission, boxed off as poison, up until that point.
Well, he did keep getting arrested with a boot full of cocaine.
Correct. And yet this guy launches what is now, whether you love it or you hate it, the most financially successful film series of all time.
I like the first Iron Man film, and then it gets a bit...
I mean, I'm not asking us to weigh up to review the movies, but the point I'm making here is simply that the thing the computer would likely go, no, you better not do that, because humans don't work in that way.
Yeah.
And my thing with Dominic Cummings, because he's possibly operating on a different social spectrum to most people walking this planet, he's unable to recognize things like that. So he thinks probably everything should just be done the way the fucking computer says it, in this very dehumanized, technocratic manner, because he doesn't understand the complexities of how humans actually work. Because everything that I've ever read about him is consistently saying that social interaction with him, he just can't actually do it. He can yell and he can rant, but in terms of actually getting people on side in a genuinely meaningful way beyond just threat and intimidation, he doesn't understand that. So it makes, again, coming back to my self-loathing, this guy is just a really fucked up individual.
A nasty piece of work.
That anybody with a brain could just not fucking hire. It's why it's only the fucking Tories that would take him on. Because only a bunch of fucking idiot sociopaths would hire a moronic sociopath in the first place.
About Alistair Campbell. So you know a bit similar?
Aye, but that's New Labour. They're pretty much Tories.
the other thing, and I am going to defend Alistair Campbell a little bit.
Oh no, here we go.
Get the fuck out.
A little bit.
This is worse than this time we defended George Bush, remember that?
No, the worst one she ever did was she said I don't like prawn cocktail crisps.
They're vile.
We never even mentioned the pandas in that one.
Right, on you go. Let's hear your defence of Alistair Campbell. This is going to be a good listen up, folks.
He's not like Dominic Cummings, is he? He is somebody that has empathy and really, really believes in things, and was trying to do something and achieve something constructive and hold a government together. You can disagree with his policies, you can disagree with the things that he did regarding the Iraq War, and I do. But he's not an arsonist. He wasn't trying to destroy the British state. He wasn't trying to destroy the civil service. He was trying to get his guys' policies done. And the policies that the Labour Party came in on in 97, I think the short version possibly is just that apart from the Iraq War, people did vote for this. Yes.
So Alistair Campbell was merely enacting what the UK public, for whatever reason, voted for that at the time.
And
whereas Dominic Cummings is different to that.
And Alistair Campbell is now somebody who's was actively advocating for Britain to remain in the EU. Was very involved with the New European newspaper. Is somebody that's does absolutely brilliant work on mental health issues and alcoholism, and talks very openly about the problems that he has had. And during some of the time that we would have issue with the things that he'd done, he was drinking and he was having mental health problems, and he was not the best version of himself. And he's somebody that's really, really trying to be the best version of himself, and he has a genuinely decent core. He's very articulate, he's funny. You don't have to agree with him, you don't have to like him, but he is not just an arsonist, whereas Dominic Cummings is just a nasty, nasty vandal.
I think he's just done a good PR exercise on himself post Blair years.
I wouldn't trust him as far as I could throw him, but that's my personal take.
I didn't say I would trust it. What I'm saying is I think you can be at a really, really low point in your life.
I think
even if you're at the top of your game in terms of your career, and you can move away from that. My biggest criticism of him would be that he hasn't owned the things that he did wrong with regards to the Iraq War, and that is the thing that I will not forgive him for.
John Prescott has, and I think I would agree with that. I mean, John Prescott was very much in amongst all of that as it was happening live. He was front bench Labour. when Alistair Campbell was at the height of his powers. But I mean, Prescott has obviously identified where they fucked up and fessed up to it. So I would agree with that. But I think there are people out there that have agendas. Like Putin has power and an agenda. Blair had power and an agenda. And they're, I think, ultimately the most dangerous ones, actually, because unlike a Cummings, who is just anarchist that I think will eventually be exposed as such, Campbell's maybe a conversation for another day. But I think that to say that he, to me, is Blair, they're a different kind of danger. Blair, I think, very openly said, this is what we're about. And when on the way up to election, I don't think there was much in the way of deception involved. Kind of what you elected was more or less what you got.
Yeah.
Until the Iraq War happened and things took an unexpected turn. Whereas I think what's happening with Cummings and Boris is you're seeing people are actively saying, we are going to be this, and they're going to be the total opposite.
Their ideology is to have power. That's pretty much it. They want to be in control.
There is
really
the
mind
horrible
how they do
possibility that the folie à deux of the pair of them could, that because there are two massive egos, which I think will eventually cause a rift, but it could well be that because they are quite different in their presentation, that they rub along quite well. But that's terrifying, because then we could have years and years of the pair of them.
No, I mean, I've said before in the podcast earlier on about I see it as a kind of actor-director relationship. I think it's that Cummings actually wants the spotlight, but it is self-aware enough to know that he doesn't have the social skills to be the guy out front. Therefore, the best he can be is your Quentin Tarantino type. In fact, very Tarantino-esque in the sense that Tarantino keeps casting himself in cameos, even though they're like 20 minutes of the fucking movie, and it's always the worst bit of any Tarantino movies when he's in it.
Stop going on about your fucking coffee.
There's... Fuck, that's a podcast for another day about my thoughts on Quentin. But but those kind of go-to actors that he works with, they're the stand-ins for what Tarantino probably wants to be, but ultimately could never really be as a performer. And I think that Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson thing is that Boris is like the avatar almost for Cummings to a certain extent. I think that's how I imagine his relationships with most politicians would work as. What he wants to try and do is psychologically manipulate them to be the stand-in for his agenda. That's what he's ultimately looking to do.
So I can see
the agenda only involves, as you said, burning shit down.
I think there's a problem here for like the Labour Party and just the left in general, and like attacking the Conservatives with Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings like heading it up, because they are a bit of a kind of movable feast kind of a thing. They've been trying to attack them as if they are just like ideologically Thatcherite, just your standard old school Tories. I just don't think they are that anymore. They've just
we're finding a shapeshifter.
They've flung like all kind of like a lot of your free market and libertarian stuff in the bin. And they're just like moving into just populism now, where they're just like, latching on to just one or two key policies that sound good to, your kind of standard working class people. And they're going to see the word people. You're going to hear that so much. It's like, we're the party of the people, the people's NHS. We're going to back that up and give you a people's wage and all this. And they're going to just like totally camp their tank on the left's lawn.
Yeah,
that's the way it's going to be. And I think
doing it, and they won.
Labour's going to be swinging and swinging. Every punch is going to miss unless they get their act sorted out and actually realise who these guys are, who Boris Johnson is, and Dominic Cummings. And it's not the old school Thatcherism that they
it's much more dangerous.
It'd be a lot easier for them to deal with.
Yeah, it's much more dangerous than that. You're absolutely right, and I can't see what an adequate strategy would be for Labour, which leads me to think that the only thing that's going to pull Labour out is actually to have their own personality at the front of the party that will draw people back, because I don't think there's any policy that, like you say, anything that the Labour Party picks up that sounds good, the Tories will just steal.
Yeah.
So there's literally nothing, and they're gonna fucking run up a massive debt. They'll probably blame that on Europe. Then they'll fucking commit suicide in 2029, hand it back to whatever fucking vestigial stump remains of the Labour Party, and they'll then have to spend 5 or 10 years clearing up the shit, getting the blame for whatever equivalent of austerity and fucking environmental fucking nonsense is having to be dealt with, at which point the Tories will just waltz back into power again, like they did last time.
Here's the issue. How do we fucking resolve it? And I think the way you resolve it is exactly what you just did. You just fucking deflate it. Because all you did there was go like, I can fucking see yous. I can see through you like cellophane. This is obvious what you lot are up to. And I don't understand why, if I was running Labour, I would be going, we have to make fun. You mock it. So when you said you're going to hear the word people all the time from these guys, that would be really effective in a debate to actually say that out loud. This is how they're going to get you. This is how they're going to try and manipulate you. I just called them out on the strategy publicly. The problem, I think that's what you're saying, is that what Labour are trying to do is attack them on policy and attack them in the way that they are this old school conventional Tory, Thatcherism, basically. Whereas you don't want to be doing that. You actually want to target the tactics, because now the policies are relevant. What they're actually doing policy-wise doesn't matter, because they'll flip-flop and fly just to cling on to power. So what you really want to call them out on is the Cambridge Analytica shit. Like, you want to focus on that. But where's the fucking Russia report? Why is every single Prime Minister's questions right now in the January 2020 not focusing solely on getting that fucking report out from the government? I think that one of the problems I watched during the Corbyn-Boris Johnson election was that one of the head-to-head debates, I felt that what was commendable for Corbyn was he was actually trying not to attack Boris, and he was trying to build up what he stood for as Labour. Now, as personally, I think that's a positive trait. I would recognise that as being a good thing in a person.
Yeah, but you cannot turn up to a gunfight armed with a rolled-up copy of the Guardian Weekend Supplement.
Correct.
You have got to fucking bring a gun!
This was exactly my takeaway from it. I was pulling my hair out, swearing at the television, very Malcolm Tucker-esque, going like, when you're asked the question by the audience, how can we trust you? And you're in a debate with Boris Johnson, if you don't have him like bloody on the floor begging for mercy by the end of that question, you're doing something wrong. And Corbyn just didn't attack him. He was about selling himself. That is a nice thing, but what it's not recognising, and that's what Free's identified, is the world that we're now in. A paradigm shift has occurred. You're now battling a populist. So you have to fight that in a very different way to how you'd fight even Tony Blair back in the day. And this is why you have to someone that is going to make this a conflict.
I can't think of anybody in the Labour Party that has the right balance of skills. There isn't anybody.
They've got quite a long time, though, to be fair, so we've got time. They should start, but just, first of all, looking competent. Just having people that know their brief and actually can answer like more than 2 questions in a row.
Yeah.
And well, they might have 1 or 2 people that can. But they've got time. You can get these folk like Rebecca Long Bailey. First time I saw her on telly, I was like, oh my god, what the hell? How's this person a politician? But now she's at least she can answer a few questions in a row quite reasonably competently. So they've got time. They could do it, and I think the one thing they can focus on is like the Tory front bench is just going to look like a bunch of toff nutters. Yeah. So that is quite an easy thing to counter. I think if you just look competent, you don't need to do too much. Just look sensible. Don't be a Diane Abbott, basically. Just be normal.
What you're describing is more or less what the SNP strategy, I think, has been under the Nicola Sturgeon lineup. Now, I think in that transitional point between the Salmond to Sturgeon bit, we had to kind of clear off a few of the less good people. But I mean, now you've got
Alan Smith.
Is a guy that is exactly what you're talking about. Someone that's not too up in your face, but comes across as competent. And I think that it's like that slow, steady wins the race argument with the SNP approach, where what they've managed to do under Sturgeon is, in the midst of this utter shit tornado that's been the Brexit aftermath,
look like a steady ship.
Just look like a steady ship. That has meant that even if you don't like them, there's this kind of, but we have to respect them. So again, we can disagree, but, a lot of people in England say that, my God, we wish we had a Nicola Sturgeon down here, because at least, I don't want the UK to break up, they might say, but I can at least respect her whenever I see her on the television. She comes across, as you see, as the steady ship. And I think what Free is saying here is that's not what Labour's come across as.
we were talking about disruptive technology, and that's something that he likes to think of himself as this disruptor. And disruptive technology can be fantastic. So, a really good example of that would be something like digital cameras, where, it used to be the case that you'd get maybe, 28 or, I don't know, was it 32 if you'd spent extra on the film photographs. You'd got no idea whether or not what you'd taken a photograph of had come out or not. It was expensive to print. It was this vast polluting industry to actually manufacture film and turn it into photographs. And memories are expensive. And all of a sudden, digital cameras come out, and in the space of a few months, an entire industry has been leveled. It's gone, and memories become free.
Ladies, keep that in mind. Memories become free every time you receive a dick pic.
I make them pay for mine, to be honest.
But, my children were born either side of that, and I have all the photos in the world of my second child, the talented artist behind Nihilist for Indie Merchandise,
which you can buy at
teespring.com/stores/nihilist for indie or something like that.
But and that difference is really marked in that I've got a handful of photographs of my son as a baby that are sort of tucked away somewhere fading. Whereas from the point at which we bought a digital camera, everything's recorded, and then mobile phones start to get cameras and everything's recorded. That's a great example of a disruptive technology that really, really worked well for people. And Dominic Cummings wants to believe of himself, I presume, that he's that kind of disruptive technology. But actually, the stuff that he's advocating is the other side of disruptive technology, which is Uber Eats drivers earning 32 pence a day. That's what he's actually doing. He's just setting fire to things. And I come back to what I said at the beginning. He's just a vandal. He is just a vandal. He's a nasty piece of work.
Is it worth considering why maybe he is less intrinsically linked to Russia? Is it because that's how, if I was Putin, I would see him as being unpredictable and uncontrollable?
I'm not saying he isn't intrinsically linked to Russia.
You just don't have any evidence yet to...
No. With regards to the Russia stuff, I was actually genuinely thinking, that it was going to be some interesting scandal of what he'd been up to. And I now think that was just the Labour Party, Did you know Dominic Cummings was in Russia for a few years in the 90s? That's a bit suspect, isn't it? Russia. And in a way that worked because it certainly got my attention. But when you actually think about the fact that he went out there at 23, it's before Putin takes power, it just doesn't make sense historically. Now, he speaks Russian. He is very, very interested in Russian literature, Russian history, apparently, knows an awful lot about it, will have connections out there, is a big advocate of, as I say, of Surkov's sort of chaos theory of politics, and certainly running the Leave campaign, we know that there was Russian influence, and we suspect that there was Russian money coming into that campaign. We can't absolutely prove that, but we strongly suspect that there was that. I don't think he's a Soviet agent, but is he potentially somebody that looks at what Putin's doing and thinking, great, same here, please. Yes, potentially, but we just don't have any evidence of it.
He does strike me as someone that's read a lot of history, but has possibly learned all the wrong lessons from it. Because I think that's the thing about these allegedly clever people. To have read about events and memorised events that have occurred does not necessarily mean you've understood them. And I think he does seem like the kind of guy that has concluded that the only way to facilitate change in the world is to destroy. And I think that if you're a young man going to Russia, as he would have been at that time, you would probably have seen radical change and upheaval occurring because it was necessary on the basis of the fallout of the Soviet Union. doesn't mean it was an awful lot of fun for the Russians to go through that.
No, and a good
that
example.
That might be the missing bit with Cummings, where if you're a kind of posh boy that knows actually at the drop of a hat I can just get on a plane and bugger off back to Durham, this is a little bit of an interesting trip. And, it's not quite emotionally
and you know what?
for you in the way that
he
it
has
for
said.
your average Russian.
He has said exactly that. If this all goes wrong, I'll just go back and live with my parents in Durham.
This is where he reminds me a lot of like the fucking white middle class tourist that buggers off to the middle of Africa to view poverty, with the reassurance that at the end of this trip you can just go home and have a nice warm bath, in your lovely comfortable flat.
If you call your dad, he can stop it all.
And I speak from a lot of fucking personal experience in that, but I think the difference is that I'm self-aware of it, and I don't think that Dominic Cummings ultimately is. I think he's done everything that he can to give people the impression that he isn't that posh boy that can ultimately just run home. I think at his core he is a pretty ignorant, cowardly snot, and he's trying to project this image of the rebellious genius, and I completely disagree with it. I think he's a guy that's read a lot about history because he's not had a lot of life experience. I think he's therefore not related to that history in a human way, if that makes sense. I think that he's looked at the history books and gone, well, this happened, therefore I could practically do things in this negative environment that I couldn't do in a positive environment. Therefore, the negative environment's the better environment to create.
I think the point that you made about looking at the massive change that happened in Russia and failing to actually think about what was that like for Russians is absolutely true. I mean, a good example being that in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, although there was this moment of opportunity, what actually happened was that men dying of heart attacks in Russia went absolutely through the roof because of the stress of it. There was this massive social upheaval and people were literally just fucking dying because of it. And there was a moment when, if, for instance, America had gone in with a Marshall Plan for Russia afterwards and helped them sort themselves out, we'd be in a very different place. But they didn't. Instead, they undermined Russia in a way that created this chaos. There was a moment when we could have made Russia something different, but America couldn't bring itself to, and instead it wanted to see Russia fall into chaos. What happened is you got a strong man, and now look where we are.
There was an article in the National by George Caravan where he described him, Dominic Cummings, as being like the Mekon from Dan Dare. I can't get that picture out of my head of this like domed-headed wee green alien floating about in a wee saucer. Just imagine him, Dominic Cummings, floating about in 10 It doesn't like, just like, you're sacked, just like evaporating people left, right, and centre. Quite a possibility that he is an alien in a human suit. Quite a badly designed one. I think the alien was probably like tasked to do it on like a Friday afternoon. You've got to make an alien suit and then invade Britain and take over Westminster.
I mean, at least in Mars Attack, they did that by giving her a beehive.
Yeah. It gets like halfway through it and it's like Friday afternoon. He's like, oh, fuck this. This'll do. I'm just going to the pub now. And that's why all his clothes look like they're hanging off him. It's just like, it doesn't look right.
There's no photograph of him. There's no photograph of him where the look in his eyes isn't one that makes you think, I would not share a cab home with you.
If you were genuinely upset at injustices like poverty or racism or sexism, when you're taking on those kind of establishments, that's a real rebellious thing. Whereas people that are always just conservatives, fundamentally overprivileged white pricks, are now framed as the rebels, when they're not. And now suddenly if you're, a gay rights activist, or you're a snowflake, or you're part of the establishment, and it's like they've tried to consciously
the liberal elite.
Yes, this is the part that breaks my head, because I feel that if you
metropolitan
really
liberal
elite,
elite,
pissed off about the injustices of the world, you would not target the things that Dominic Cummings does. It's wearing a fucking hoodie in number 10. It's like, hey, I could fucking do that. They could have, whoa, man, that's not fucking rock and roll. That's not rebellion. We're going to take down the EU. Oh, okay. Like, what's it about? Human rights? Oh yeah, fuck, that's terrible. Burn that to the ground. As opposed to, what about all the fucking drug lords in the world? What about people that, are fucking horrible pimps that are getting women addicted to heroin and putting them out in the streets? What about something like that? Do you want to go against that? That would be really meaningful if you stood up to that. But no, because I'm a private school white boy that ultimately has no balls, I'll just go after the soft targets. And that's what he does, and I don't understand how a country could become enamoured with that kind of politics. But yet those people exist, and I guess it's marketing. It's the power of fucking marketing. You said earlier on the podcast, that idea, it's like the cheeseburger, like at McDonald's. It obviously tastes like shit. It has no nutritional value. Why would you eat this? I'm loving it. That's all you have to tell them. You're loving it. Oh, fucking get me some more drive-thrus.
The secret is to find a good enemy. I think that's what you need to do in politics. Get folk to hate something. You need to get this, build up a real bad guy enemy that probably doesn't even exist, and that's your secret to success.
Well, do you know what? Then I think Johnson's given us a gift, because I think people will tire of his shtick quite quickly, and I think he makes a very, very good bad guy.
Yeah.
And
we said he looks like a Bond villain before. It's definitely, you can see my cat in his lap.
Yeah. So it won't be too difficult if the left can just find somebody with a personality to stick on the fucking front bench to actually to vilify him, and that can be the undoing. But then the Tories will just fucking bin him and put somebody else in before the next election.
I think they're running out. The longer all this goes, their core demographic are literally dying off. So that's problem number one. Secondly, they're going through their leaders at a ridiculous rate. We've already had 3 Tory prime ministers in the last, 5 years? We had Cameron, we had May, and then we get Boris.
2016 to 2020, we've had 3 in.
The whole time through all this, all the different Labour leaders, all the different Tory leaders, all the different Lib Dem leaders, Scotland's had one leader. We've had Nicola's been there the whole fucking time. That's a normal fucking length.
Yeah.
Whereas down south, it's just fucking chaos.
Whatever you do, don't shag a Tory.
Just don't shag a Tory.
Don't shag a Tory.
I actually love...
Fuck the Tories, but don't fuck the Tories.